Randy Kraft was a serial killer who murdered at least 16 young men between 1972 and 1983, but police believe he actually killed 67 people, making him one of the most deadly serial killers in American history. He got his nickname the Scorecard Killer because he kept a coded list with 61 entries that police found in his car, which they believe was his way of keeping track of all the people he murdered. Randy Stephen Kraft was born on March 19, 1945, in Long Beach, California. His parents were Harold Herbert Kraft and Opal Lee Kraft. Randy was the youngest child in the family and the only boy. He had 3 older sisters who all loved their baby brother very much. The sisters were named Doris, Kay, and Shirley, and they were much older than Randy. Doris was 12 years older than him and used to rock him in her arms and sing him to sleep when he was a baby. Randy seemed like a calm and quiet baby, but his childhood was not perfect. When he was just 1 year old, he fell off the couch and broke his collarbone. When he was 2 years old, he fell down a flight of stairs and got knocked out. His parents took him to the hospital, and the doctors said there was no permanent damage, but these early accidents might have been signs of things to come. In 1948, when Randy was 3 years old, his family moved from Long Beach to Westminster in Orange County, California. They moved to a small community called Midway City, which was just 1 square mile of land on the Westminster border. The house they moved into used to be barracks for the Women's Army Corps during World War II. Randy's father, Harold, bought the house and fixed it up for his family. Harold Kraft worked hard to support his family, and so did Randy's mother, Opal. They both had jobs to make ends meet. The family was able to buy and build a small 3-room house on the site where the old Army barracks used to be. Their house was near the Pacific Ocean in an area that had retail stores and businesses. When Randy was growing up in Westminster in the 1940s and 1950s, it was very different from what it is today. Back then, there were chicken farms and orange groves all around. There was even the world's largest goldfish farm, which had over 700,000 fish on 40 acres of land. Westminster was not even an official city until 1957, when Randy was 12 years old. Randy was a very smart child. When he was tested, they found out his IQ was 129, which put him in the top 3 to 4% of all people. This high intelligence would help him in school, but it would also help him plan his crimes later in life. Randy went to Midway City Elementary School, where his teachers were impressed with how smart he was. He was so advanced that they let him attend accelerated classes at 17th Street Junior High School. Randy's father, Harold, did not show the same level of love and attention to Randy that his mother and sisters did. Harold seemed to prefer spending time with his daughters and wife during his free time. This lack of attention from his father might have affected Randy, though no one really knows for sure. As Randy got older, he became interested in politics. When he was in high school, he dreamed of becoming a senator someday. He was very conservative in his political views during his teenage years. His high school classmates described him as being somewhere right of Attila the Hun because of how extremely conservative he was. Randy went to Westminster High School, where he continued to get very good grades. He graduated 10th in his class out of 390 students in June 1963. His excellent grades and test scores earned him a scholarship to Claremont Men's College in Claremont, California, where he decided to study economics. But during high school, Randy began to realize something about himself that he kept secret. He knew he was attracted to other males, but this was something he could not talk about with anyone. In the 1960s, being homosexual was not accepted by society, and it was even illegal in many places. Randy kept this part of himself hidden from his family, his friends, and his classmates. When Randy started at Claremont Men's College in 1963, he was still very conservative in his political beliefs. He strongly supported the Vietnam War and campaigned hard for Barry Goldwater in the 1964 presidential election. Randy was also part of the Reserve Officers Training Corps, which prepared college students to become military officers. During his first year of college, Randy worked as a bartender at a bar in Garden Grove while going to school. He was also secretly meeting other men in places like Laguna Beach and Huntington Beach, but he still kept his homosexuality a complete secret from everyone who knew him. In 1966, Randy had his first run-in with the law. He was arrested for lewd conduct in Huntington Beach after he propositioned an undercover police officer who was posing as a gay prostitute. Since Randy had no prior criminal record, he was able to get the charges against him dropped, but this incident showed that he was becoming more bold about his secret desires. Something big happened to Randy's political beliefs during college. The year 1968 was a time of great change in America, with protests happening all over the world. Randy was influenced by these protests and completely changed his political views. He stopped supporting the Vietnam War and became very liberal instead of conservative. He grew a beard and started supporting Robert Kennedy instead of conservative politicians like Barry Goldwater. Randy worked so hard on Robert Kennedy's campaign that he received a personally signed letter from Bobby Kennedy thanking him for his work. But Randy's world was shaken when Robert Kennedy was assassinated on June 5th, 1968. This event deeply affected Randy and many other young people who had believed in Kennedy's message of change and hope. Randy was supposed to graduate from college in June 1967, but he was a few credits short because he had been partying too much and not paying enough attention to his studies. He had to repeat a class and ended up graduating 8 months later in February 1968 with a bachelor's degree in economics. During his college years, Randy also had his first serious relationship with another man. It was with a black man named Mike, and Randy later said that he really loved and cared for him. Randy was brave enough to bring Mike home to meet his parents, which must have been a very awkward and difficult situation for everyone involved, especially in the 1960s when interracial relationships were not widely accepted. In 1966, Randy moved off campus and lived with a male roommate. There were rumors that both men were secretly homosexual, but Randy continued to keep his sexuality hidden from most people in his life. After Randy graduated from college in February 1968, he decided to join the United States Air Force. 4 months after graduation, Randy enlisted and began his military service. He was assigned to Edwards Air Force Base, which is located just north of Los Angeles, California. In the Air Force, Randy worked as a computer operator and supervised the painting of test planes. He was very good at his job and was quickly given high security clearance because of his clean background checks and high test scores. Randy seemed to really enjoy his time in the military at first, and he was promoted to the rank of Airman First Class. But Randy's military career would not last long. In 1969, after serving for about 1 year, Randy made a life-changing decision. He decided to publicly come out as homosexual for the first time in his life. He told his superiors at Edwards Air Force Base about his sexuality. In 1969, being openly gay in the military was not allowed. The military had a policy against homosexual serving, and when Randy came out, his sexuality was not well received by his commanding officers. Shortly after coming out, Randy was given a general discharge from the Air Force for what they called medical reasons. This was the military's way of getting rid of gay service members without making it obvious that they were being kicked out for their sexuality. Randy tried to fight this discharge. He got legal advice from an attorney and tried to challenge the grounds for his discharge because he wanted to continue serving his country. But the Air Force refused to change the status of his discharge, and Randy was forced to leave the military. After being discharged from the Air Force, Randy moved back into his parents' house in Orange County. He got a job as a bartender, which gave him access to many different types of people. He also enrolled in some teaching courses, though it's not clear if he ever planned to become a teacher. Being kicked out of the military for being gay was a traumatic experience for Randy. He had been doing well in the Air Force and had really enjoyed his service, but he was forced to leave because of who he was. This rejection and discrimination may have contributed to the anger and resentment that would later fuel his violent crimes. During this time, Randy was living 3 different lives. To his family and some friends, he was still the smart, successful young man they had always known. To others in the gay community, he was an openly homosexual man looking for relationships and sexual encounters. But there was a third life that Randy was beginning to develop, a dark, violent life that he hid from everyone. After leaving the military, Randy began to become more involved in the gay community in Southern California. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, gay men in the Orange County area centered their social lives around 3 main bars: Broomhilda's, Stables, and Bowie's Shed. Randy worked as a bartender at one of these bars after his discharge from the military. These bars were important meeting places for gay men who were traveling between Los Angeles and Laguna Beach. They served as stopping points for people who were either heading home from the beach or going to Laguna Beach to escape the city. For Randy, these bars became an important part of his new gay social life. Randy threw himself completely into this new lifestyle. His roommates later said that his diet of speed and beer led him to have strange behaviors. He would sometimes disappear for days at a time, and other times he would lock himself in his room for equally long periods. These disappearances would later become much more sinister. Around this time, Randy met a young runaway on the Huntington Beach boardwalk. The boy's name was Fancher, and he was very confident and outgoing. Randy was described as having sandy blonde hair and a mustache, and people said he had a mild, urbane manner about him. This pleasant appearance and manner would help Randy lure victims throughout his killing spree. Randy's first suspected victim was Wayne Joseph Duquette, a 30-year-old bartender who worked at a gay bar called The Stables. Duquette's body was found off the Ortega Highway in California on October 5, 1971. By the time his body was discovered, it had decomposed so much that any potential signs of foul play could not be detected. The official cause of death was ruled as alcohol poisoning. At the time, no one connected Duquette's death to Randy Kraft. It was only much later, when Randy's scorecard was discovered, that investigators realized the connection. The first entry on Randy's scorecard read Stable, which prosecutors believed referred to Wayne Duquette, who worked at the Stables bar. The murder of Wayne Duquette marked the beginning of what would become a 12-year reign of terror. Randy had discovered that he enjoyed killing, and he would not stop until he was caught. Starting in 1972, bodies began turning up along highways across California with increasing frequency. All of the victims were men, and most of them showed clear evidence of trauma or torture. Some showed signs of being bound, beaten, and bitten, while others showed signs that they had been strangled. Several had been sodomized, castrated, or otherwise dismembered. At least 4 victims had been found with foreign objects inserted into their bodies. Randy's method was becoming clear. He would typically lure his victims into his vehicle with an offer of a ride or alcohol. Once he had them in his car, he would give them alcohol and drugs, usually tranquilizers like Valium. When the victims were unconscious or unable to fight back, Randy would bind them, torture them, and sexually abuse them before killing them. Randy's victims were usually killed by strangulation, asphyxiation, or bludgeoning, though some victims had also been given lethal doses of drugs. At least one victim was stabbed to death. After killing his victims, Randy would dispose of their bodies, usually along or close to various freeways in Southern California. In the early 1970s, Randy began a relationship with a man named Jeffrey Allen Graves. This relationship would be very important in Randy's life and would later become a key part of the investigation into his crimes. Jeffrey Graves was Randy's boyfriend from approximately 1971 to 1976, which means their relationship lasted during some of Randy's most active killing years. Graves had a studio apartment in Seal Beach, and he invited Randy to be his roommate. The two men moved in together and had what they called an open relationship, which meant they were allowed to have sexual encounters with other men. Randy and Jeffrey would frequently go to bars together and meet other men for threesomes and other sexual encounters. Jeffrey noticed that Randy seemed to have a particular preference for Marines, which would become a pattern in Randy's victims. Many of Randy's eventual victims were members of the United States Marine Corps. Even though Randy was living with Jeffrey and was part of the gay community, he still was not openly gay to many people in his life. Being homosexual was still very taboo in the 1970s, and Randy kept his sexuality hidden from his co-workers and many of his friends. He was essentially living 3 separate lives: his public life, where he appeared to be a normal, straight man, his gay life with Jeffrey and the gay community, and his secret life as a killer. Randy told one of his friends during the early 1970s that, "There's a part of me you will never know." This statement would prove to be very true. One of Randy's later roommates recalled after Randy's arrest that Randy used to go away for a few days at a time and then come back and lock himself in his room for a couple more days. The roommate said Randy would often go down by the Marine base, presumably to find victims. Randy was becoming quite skilled at being a chameleon and living these multiple lives. He was developing into what investigators would later call a championship-level liar. His ability to appear normal and trustworthy would help him lure victims and avoid suspicion for many years. The relationship with Jeffrey Graves would eventually become strained. Randy was not satisfied with their open relationship and became jealous when Jeffrey had encounters with other men. Randy would often go out cruising for men when he was feeling jealous or upset with Jeffrey. These cruising trips were when Randy would find many of his victims. Investigators later believed that Jeffrey Graves might have been Randy's accomplice in some of the murders. There was evidence that some of Randy's crimes required more than one person to carry out, particularly when it came to moving and disposing of bodies. However, Jeffrey Graves was never charged with any crimes, and the extent of his knowledge about Randy's activities remains unclear. The relationship between Randy and Jeffrey ended around 1976, but Jeffrey would later become important to the investigation. When Randy was eventually arrested and tried for murder, prosecutors wanted to question Jeffrey about his knowledge of Randy's activities. However, Jeffrey Graves died of AIDS in 1987, just a few months before Randy's trial began. This meant that investigators never got the chance to fully question him about what he knew. Before Jeffrey died, he did take a polygraph test as part of the investigation. During this test, he made a strange comment, saying, "I'm really not going to pay for it, you know." This comment raised suspicions about his involvement, but he passed the polygraph test, and investigators were never able to get more information from him before he died. Randy's first confirmed murder victim was Edward Daniel Moore, a 20-year-old Marine from Camp Pendleton. Moore was last seen leaving the Marine barracks on December 24, 1972, Christmas Eve. His body was found beside the 405 freeway in Seal Beach during the early morning hours of December 26, 1972, the day after Christmas. The discovery of Edward Moore's body was horrifying. Evidence showed that he had been pushed from a moving vehicle, which caused abrasions on his body. An autopsy revealed that Moore had been bound at the wrists and ankles with rope or cord. He had been beaten with a blunt instrument about the face and head before being strangled to death with a garrote, which is a device used for strangulation. Moore's body also showed numerous bite marks, indicating that his attacker had bitten him during the assault. Most disturbing of all, investigators found that a sock had been forced into Moore's rectum. This detail would become a signature of Randy's crimes, as many of his future victims would be found with socks or other objects inserted into their bodies. The murder of Edward Daniel Moore established a pattern that Randy would follow for the next 11 years. His victims were typically young men, often Marines or other military personnel. They were usually picked up while hitchhiking or while out at bars. Randy would drug them, torture them, sexually assault them, and then kill them before dumping their bodies along freeways or in remote locations. 6 weeks after the murder of Edward Moore, on February 6, 1973, the body of another victim was found alongside the Terminal Island Freeway in Wilmington. This victim was never identified, but investigators estimated that he was between 17 and 25 years old. Like Edward Moore, this victim had been strangled with a ligature and also had a sock inserted in his rectum. 2 months later, on April 14, 1973, the body of 17-year-old Kevin Clark Bailey was found beside a road in Huntington Beach. Bailey had been castrated and sodomized before his murder. By this point, it was becoming clear to investigators that they had a serial killer operating in Southern California. By July 28, 1973, 2 more victims had been murdered. An unidentified youth whose dismembered body was found in Wilmington on April 22nd, and a 20-year-old named Ronnie Jean Weeb, whose strangled body was found beside an on-ramp of the 405 freeway on July 30th. Weeb had disappeared 2 days earlier. Randy killed at least once more in 1973. The victim was Vincent Cruz Mestes, a 23-year-old bisexual art student. Mestes' body was found in the San Bernardino Mountains on December 29, 1973. As with several previous victims, one of Mestes' socks had been forced into his rectum. Most horrifically, Mestes' hands had been severed from his body and were never found. The murder of Vincent Mestes showed that Randy's crimes were becoming more violent and more elaborate. The fact that he cut off his victims' hands suggested that Randy was taking trophies from his victims or was trying to make identification more difficult. By November 1974, 5 more victims had been found beside or close to major roadways in Southern California. 3 of these victims had been conclusively linked to the same killer through physical evidence and similar methods of murder. 2 of these victims were 20-year-old Malcolm Eugene Little and 19-year-old James Dale Reeves. Both had been found beside freeways with foreign objects inserted into their bodies, following the pattern established with previous victims. The third victim was 18-year-old Marine Roger Edward Dickerson, whose body showed evidence of bite marks similar to those found on Edward Daniel Moore and other earlier victims. The investigation was being hampered by the fact that Southern California had multiple serial killers operating at the same time during the 1970s. 2 other men, Patrick Kearney and William Bonin, were also killing young men and dumping their bodies near freeways during this same time period. All three killers were sometimes referred to as freeway killers because of their method of disposing of bodies, which confused investigators and the media. Patrick Kearney was arrested in 1977 and confessed to killing 35 people. When he was caught, investigators thought they had solved the freeway murders, but the killings continued. This told them that there was more than one killer operating in the area. William Bonin was arrested in 1980, and again investigators hoped they had caught the freeway killer. But even after Bonin was arrested, bodies continued to appear, which meant there was at least one more killer still operating. Randy Kraft was the third and final freeway killer, and he would not be caught until 1983. During this time, he was becoming more confident and more brutal in his methods. He was also becoming better at avoiding detection by law enforcement. Randy had several advantages that helped him avoid capture. He was highly intelligent, with an IQ of 129. He was well-educated and articulate. He had a normal job as a computer programmer, which gave him a respectable cover story. He lived a seemingly normal life and had friends and relationships that made him appear to be a regular member of society. Randy was also very careful about how he selected and approached his victims. He typically targeted young men who were hitchhiking or who were in vulnerable situations. Many of his victims were Marines or other military personnel who were away from their families and might not be missed immediately if they disappeared. Randy's victims were usually gay or bisexual men, or young men who might be experimenting with their sexuality. In the 1970s, being gay was still very stigmatized, and many gay men lived secretive lives. This meant that if they disappeared, their families might not know where to look for them or might be reluctant to report them missing. Randy also carefully planned his crimes. He would drug his victims with alcohol and tranquilizers to make them unable to resist or escape. He had a system for restraining them, torturing them, and disposing of their bodies. He chose locations for dumping bodies that would make it difficult for investigators to find evidence or trace the crimes back to him. Around 1976, Randy's relationship with Jeffrey Graves ended, and he began a new long-term relationship with a man named Jeffrey Allen Seelig. Jeff Seelig was a 25-year-old candy shop operator who would become Randy's roommate and live with him for the next 7 years, until Randy's arrest in 1983. Jeff Seelig was different from Jeffrey Graves in that he seemed to have no knowledge of Randy's criminal activities. While investigators suspected that Jeffrey Graves might have been an accomplice to some of Randy's crimes, they found no evidence that Jeff Seelig was involved in or aware of the murders. Randy and Jeff Seelig lived together at 824 Roswell Avenue in Long Beach, California. They shared this house from 1976 until Randy's arrest in 1983. To the outside world, they appeared to be a normal couple living a quiet life. Jeff operated his candy shop business, and Randy worked as a computer programmer and consultant. Jeff Seelig later told investigators that he had no idea about Randy's dark side. He said that Randy seemed like a normal, caring partner who was committed to their relationship and to his work. Jeff described Randy as intelligent, politically active, loyal to his friends, and dedicated to his job. However, there were signs that something was not right, even if Jeff did not recognize them at the time. Jeff later recalled that Randy would sometimes go away for a few days at a time, without explanation. When Randy returned from these trips, he would often lock himself in his room for days and would not want to talk about where he had been or what he had done. Jeff also noticed that Randy's behavior seemed to change depending on the status of their relationship. When they were getting along well, Randy seemed calm and happy. But when they were having problems or arguments, Randy would become moody and would disappear more frequently. Investigators later realized that Randy's killing activities seemed to increase during times when his relationship with Jeff was strained. During the time Randy was living with Jeff Seelig, his killing spree continued and even escalated. Some of Randy's most brutal crimes occurred during this period, but Jeff was apparently so trusting and naive that he never suspected anything was wrong. This ability to completely compartmentalize his life and hide his true nature from the person closest to him showed just how skilled Randy had become at deception. He was able to live as a loving partner to Jeff while simultaneously being one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The relationship with Jeff Seelig would prove to be important to the investigation in another way. After Randy's arrest, investigators found that Randy had kept souvenirs and trophies from his victims in the house he shared with Jeff. This included photographs of victims, personal items belonging to victims, and other evidence of his crimes. The fact that Randy was able to keep these items in his home without Jeff noticing or becoming suspicious showed either that Jeff was completely oblivious to what was happening, or that Randy was extremely careful about hiding his activities. Most investigators believe that Jeff truly had no knowledge of Randy's crimes. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, Randy continued his killing spree while living what appeared to be a normal life with Jeff Seelig. During this period, he committed some of his most brutal murders and had several close calls with law enforcement that could have led to his earlier capture. One of Randy's victims during this period was 23-year-old Roland Young, who was released from the Orange County Jail on June 10, 1978, for public intoxication. Young was found dead at 3:30 a.m. on June 11th, just one day after his release, in an Irvine gutter. His body contained alcohol and diazepam in his blood, and evidence showed that his body had bounced when it was thrown from a fast-moving vehicle. Young's wrists were bound, part of his genitals had been severed, and he had been stabbed multiple times in the heart area. After the mutilation, his body had been redressed. The murder of Roland Young was particularly significant because it appeared on Randy's scorecard as jail out, referring to the fact that Young had just been released from jail. This was one of the clearest connections between Randy's scorecard and his actual victims. Another victim during this period was Eric Herbert Church, a 21-year-old from Hartford, Connecticut, who was found dead on January 27, 1983, in Seal Beach. Church had been hitchhiking across the country when he encountered Randy. He was found sodomized, bludgeoned, and strangled along the 605 freeway. Photos of Church were later found in Randy's car when he was arrested. Randy had several encounters with law enforcement during this period that could have led to his capture if investigators had been more alert to the patterns. In some cases, Randy was questioned about missing persons or found bodies, but he was always able to talk his way out of suspicion. One close call occurred when Randy was questioned about the disappearance of Keith Davin Crotwell and Mark Hall in 1975. These two young men had gone for a car ride with Randy after meeting him at a bar. Randy had given them alcohol and drugs, and one of them, Mark Hall, lost consciousness in the back seat. Hall was later pushed out of Randy's moving car and survived, but Crotwell disappeared and was never seen again. When investigators questioned Randy about this incident, he provided an alibi. He claimed that Jeffrey Graves had been with him that night and could verify his story. Randy and Jeffrey told investigators that they had gotten stuck in the mud while driving and had called for help. They claimed that Crotwell had disappeared while they were walking to get assistance. This alibi was accepted by investigators at the time, but it later became suspicious. The fact that Randy used his boyfriend as an alibi and that Jeffrey Graves went along with the story made investigators wonder if Jeffrey had been involved in Randy's crimes or at least knew about them. During this period, Randy was also becoming more bold and taking greater risks. He was keeping more trophies from his victims, including photographs, personal items, and even body parts. He was also leaving more evidence at crime scenes, either because he was becoming careless or because he was getting a thrill from the risk of being caught. Randy's scorecard was growing during this time as well. He was adding new entries for each victim, using coded references that would help him remember his crimes without creating obvious evidence if the list were discovered. The scorecard served as both a trophy and a practical tool for Randy to keep track of his murders. Randy's method of killing had become highly systematic by the late 1970s. He had developed a careful process for selecting victims, luring them to their deaths, and disposing of their bodies while avoiding detection. Randy typically selected his victims from specific locations and types of people. He frequently targeted Marines from Camp Pendleton, young hitchhikers, and men he met at gay bars. He seemed to prefer victims who were between 13 and 35 years old, with most being in their late teens or early 20s. Randy had a particular talent for appearing trustworthy and harmless. He was well-dressed, articulate, and drove a nice car. He could easily convince young men to accept rides or to come with him for drinks or other activities. His mild manner and friendly appearance made him seem like a safe person to be around. Once Randy had lured a victim into his car, he would offer them alcohol or drugs. Randy always carried supplies in his vehicle, including beer, hard liquor, and prescription drugs like Valium and other tranquilizers. He would encourage his victims to drink heavily or would slip drugs into their drinks without their knowledge. When the victims became unconscious or too intoxicated to resist, Randy would restrain them using rope, cord, or the victim's own shoelaces. He would then drive to a secluded location where he could torture and kill his victim without being disturbed. Randy's torture methods were extremely brutal and showed that he took pleasure in causing pain and suffering. He would burn victims with a car cigarette lighter, usually around the genitals, chest, and face. He would bite victims, leaving distinctive marks on their bodies. He would beat victims with blunt objects, causing severe trauma to their faces and heads. Many victims were sexually assaulted and sodomized. Some were castrated or had their genitals mutilated. Randy would often insert foreign objects into his victims' rectums, with socks being the most common item. This became one of his signature methods and helped investigators link different crimes to the same killer. Randy would usually kill his victims by strangulation, often using ligatures like belts, rope, or cord. Some victims were asphyxiated or bludgeoned to death. A few victims were given lethal overdoses of drugs. At least one victim was stabbed to death. After killing his victims, Randy would often take photographs of their bodies. These photographs served as trophies that Randy could keep to remember his crimes. He would also sometimes take personal items from his victims as additional souvenirs. Randy would then dispose of the bodies, usually by dumping them alongside freeways or in remote areas. He often threw bodies from his moving car, which would cause additional trauma and make it look like the victims had been hit by vehicles. This method also helped Randy avoid being seen at the dump sites. Randy was careful to clean his car and dispose of evidence after each murder. However, he was not perfect in this regard, and investigators would later find bloodstains, hair, fiber evidence, and other traces of his victims in his vehicle and home. The scorecard that Randy kept was perhaps his most distinctive feature as a serial killer. This coded list allowed him to keep track of his crimes while maintaining plausible deniability if the list were discovered. Each entry on the scorecard corresponded to a specific victim, using references that would be meaningful to Randy but might seem innocent to someone else. For example, the entry stable referred to Wayne Duquette, who worked at the stable's bar. Marine Carson referred to Richard Allen Keith, a Marine who was killed in Carson, California. Jail Out referred to Roland Young, who was killed shortly after being released from jail. New Year's Eve referred to a victim who was last seen at a New Year's Eve party. The scorecard allowed Randy to relive his crimes and keep count of his victims. It also showed his organized, methodical approach to murder. The fact that he kept such careful records demonstrated both his intelligence and his arrogance. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Randy began expanding his killing territory beyond Southern California. His work as a computer consultant required him to travel to other states for business, and he used these trips as opportunities to commit murders in new locations. Randy committed murders in Oregon and Michigan in addition to his California crimes. These out-of-state murders were initially not connected to Randy or to each other, which allowed Randy to avoid detection for even longer. In Oregon, Randy killed at least 6 people. One of his Oregon victims was Michael O'Fallon, a 17-year-old whose body was found along Interstate 5, near the Talbot Road exit in Marion County on July 17, 1980. The next day, July 18, 1980, another body was found along the same interstate near Woodburn. This victim remained unidentified for more than 40 years until investigators recently determined that he was Larry Eugene Parks, a 30-year-old Vietnam veteran. The connection between Randy and his Oregon victims was eventually established when investigators found a camera in Randy's garage after his arrest. The camera had the initials of Michael O'Fallon's mother inscribed on it, and she identified it during Randy's trial as belonging to her son. Randy also killed at least 2 people in Michigan in December 1982. These victims were found in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and investigators later learned that Randy had been in the area on a business trip at the time of the murders. Randy's scorecard included an entry, GR2, which prosecutors believed referred to these 2 Grand Rapids victims. The Michigan murders were particularly significant because witnesses had seen Randy talking to the victims before they disappeared. Randy's car keys were found in his hotel room, along with a bottle opener and a jacket belonging to one of the victims. Despite this evidence, Randy was never charged with the Michigan murders. though investigators were confident he was responsible. Randy's ability to commit murders in multiple states while maintaining his cover as a traveling computer consultant showed his skill at compartmentalizing his life and avoiding suspicion. He was able to appear as a legitimate businessman while using his business travel as a cover for murder. The interstate nature of Randy's crimes also complicated the investigation. Different law enforcement agencies in different states were investigating murders that were actually connected, but they did not initially realize the connections. This allowed Randy to continue killing for years without being detected. Randy's scorecard would eventually help investigators connect murders across different states. When the coded list was deciphered, it became clear that Randy had been keeping track of victims in California, Oregon, and Michigan. This helped investigators understand the true scope of Randy's crimes and led to him being suspected in dozens of additional murders. The expansion of Randy's killing territory also showed his increasing confidence and boldness. He was no longer content to kill only in his local area, but was willing to commit murders wherever his travels took him. This expansion also increased his risk of being caught, as it put him in contact with more law enforcement agencies and left more evidence trails. By 1983, Randy had been killing for more than a decade, and his crimes were becoming more frequent and more brutal. Two of his final victims would prove to be crucial to his eventual capture and conviction. Eric Herbert Church was a 21-year-old from Hartford, Connecticut, who was hitchhiking across the country when he encountered Randy. Church was found dead on January 27, 1983, in Seal Beach, California. He had been sodomized, bludgeoned, and strangled. Church's body was found along the 605 freeway, following Randy's usual pattern of dumping bodies near highways. What made Church's murder particularly important to the investigation was that Randy had photographed Church's body after killing him. These photographs were found in Randy's car when he was arrested, providing direct evidence linking Randy to Church's murder. The photographs showed Church either dead or unconscious, and the background imagery revealed that the photos had been taken at Randy's home. The second crucial victim was Terry Lee Gambrell, a 25-year-old Marine who would become Randy's final victim and the one who would lead to his capture. Gambrell disappeared on May 13, 1983, after leaving his base at Camp Pendleton. His body would be found the next day in Randy's car, leading to Randy's arrest and the end of his killing spree. The murder of Terry Gambrell followed Randy's usual pattern, but with some important differences. Randy had picked up Gambrell, probably offering him a ride or drinks. Randy then drugged Gambrell with alcohol and tranquilizers, bound his hands with his own shoelaces, and strangled him to death with his own belt. What was different about Gambrell's murder was that Randy did not dispose of the body immediately. Instead, he kept Gambrell's body in his car and continued driving around with the corpse in the passenger seat. This decision would prove to be Randy's fatal mistake. On the night of May 13th to 14th, 1983, Randy was driving erratically on Interstate 5, near Mission Viejo, California, with Terry Gambrell's dead body slumped in the passenger seat. A jacket covered Gambrell's body, making it appear that he was simply sleeping or passed out. Randy's erratic driving attracted the attention of two California Highway Patrol officers who were patrolling the freeway that night. The officers thought they had encountered a drunk driver and decided to pull Randy over for a traffic stop. At approximately 1 a.m. on May 14th, 1983, California Highway Patrol officers Sterling Franks and Tom Grunwald observed a brown Toyota Celica weaving erratically on Interstate 5 near Mission Viejo. The car was drifting between lanes and driving at an inconsistent speed, leading the officers to suspect that the driver was intoxicated. The officers activated their emergency lights and pulled the Toyota over to the side of the freeway. The driver, who appeared calm and cooperative, got out of his car and began walking toward the patrol vehicle in a polite manner. This driver was Randy Kraft, though the officers did not know his identity at the time. The officers were initially focused on conducting a standard drunk driving investigation. Randy appeared to be intoxicated and failed the field sobriety tests that the officers administered. He showed signs of being under the influence of alcohol and possibly drugs, and he was unsteady on his feet. However, the officers' attention was drawn to the passenger seat of Randy's car. There appeared to be someone slumped over in the seat, covered by a jacket. The officers approached the vehicle to check on the passenger's welfare, thinking that perhaps Randy had been driving with someone who was also intoxicated or who might need medical attention. When the officers pulled the jacket away from the passenger, they made a horrifying discovery. The person in the seat was not sleeping or passed out. he was dead. The body was that of Terry Lee Gambrell, the 25-year-old Marine who had disappeared from Camp Pendleton the previous day. The officers immediately noticed that Gambrell's pants were unzipped and his genitals were exposed. His hands were bound behind his back with what appeared to be his own shoelaces, and there were welt marks around his wrists from the restraints. Most disturbing of all, there was a ligature mark around Gambrell's neck, indicating that he had been strangled to death. Randy's demeanor during this discovery was chilling. Even when confronted with the dead body in his car, he maintained his calm, polite manner. He acted as if Gambrell was simply a friend who had passed out, and he even asked the officers if Gambrell was okay. This bizarre behavior immediately raised the officers' suspicions about Randy's involvement in Gambrell's death. Randy was immediately arrested and taken into custody. The officers secured the crime scene and called for additional investigators and the coroner's office. What had started as a routine traffic stop for suspected drunk driving had turned into the arrest of one of America's most prolific serial killers. The initial investigation at the scene revealed additional disturbing evidence. Randy's car was searched, and investigators found prescription drug bottles with Randy's name on them. The drugs included Valium, diazepam, and propranolol, both of which were depressants that could cause extreme drowsiness in large doses. These drugs matched substances that had been found in the systems of other unsolved murder victims in Southern California. Investigators also noticed that the seat cushion where Gambrell's body had been found was heavily saturated with blood, even though Gambrell himself was not bleeding. This suggested that Randy had used the same seat for previous victims and had not thoroughly cleaned it between murders. At 5:45 a.m. that morning, Detective Ray Sidebotham of the Orange County Sheriff's Department went to the county jail to question Randy about the body in his car. Randy invoked his right to remain silent and refused to talk about what had happened. This silence would continue throughout Randy's arrest, trial, and imprisonment. He has never admitted to any of the murders he was charged with. After Randy's arrest, investigators obtained a search warrant for his vehicle and his home. What they found during these searches provided overwhelming evidence of Randy's crimes and revealed the true scope of his killing spree. The search of Randy's car produced two key pieces of evidence that would prove crucial to the prosecution's case. The first was a packet of 47 color photographs found hidden in the vehicle. These photographs showed several young men, many of them nude and apparently lifeless. The photos appeared to be trophies that Randy had taken after killing his victims. The photographs were particularly damning because they showed victims in various states of undress and consciousness. Some appeared to be dead, while others appeared to be drugged or asleep. The background imagery in some of the photos revealed that they had been taken at Randy's home or inside his car, directly linking him to the victims. Two of the young men in the photographs were quickly identified. One was Eric Herbert Church, whose body had been found 4 months earlier in Seal Beach. The other was Roger James DeVole Jr., who had been murdered along with his friend Jeffrey Allen Nelson in February 1983. These identifications provided direct evidence linking Randy to specific murders. The second crucial piece of evidence found in Randy's car was even more significant. Inside a briefcase in the trunk, investigators found a notebook containing a handwritten list of notations. The list contained 61 entries with cryptic phrases like Airplane Hill, Jail Out, New Year's Eve, 2 in 1 Hitch, and Parking Lot. Randy's attorneys would later call this list People's Exhibit 25, while prosecutors called it the death list, or scorecard. Prosecutors believed that each of the 61 notations represented a young man that Randy had murdered. This belief led to Randy being nicknamed the Scorecard Killer. The scorecard was written in Randy's handwriting and appeared to be his method of keeping track of his victims. The entries used coded language that would be meaningful to Randy, but might seem innocent to someone else who found the list. For example, Marine Carson referred to a Marine who was killed in Carson, California, while MCHB Tattoo referred to a Marine Corps private with heavily tattooed arms who was last seen in Huntington Beach. The search of Randy's home at 824 Roswell Avenue in Long Beach revealed even more evidence. Investigators found articles of clothing that belonged to various murder victims. They also found fiber evidence that matched materials found at crime scenes. Hair samples found in Randy's home matched hair found on victims' bodies. Perhaps most disturbing of all, investigators found additional photographs hidden in Randy's bedroom. These photos matched the identities of victims from 3 previously unsolved murder cases, providing further evidence of Randy's involvement in multiple murders. Randy's fingerprints were also found to match prints discovered at several crime scenes. At one murder scene, Randy's fingerprints were found on a glass bottle, providing direct physical evidence of his presence at the location where a victim was killed. The accumulation of physical evidence was overwhelming. Investigators had photographs, fingerprints, fibers, hair, personal belongings of victims, the coded scorecard, and the body found in Randy's car. This evidence connected Randy to at least 16 specific murders and suggested his involvement in dozens more. Work and travel records found during the search also placed Randy in specific locations where victims had been abducted or their bodies had been discovered. Gasoline receipts showed that Randy had been traveling to areas where murders had occurred around the times of those crimes. After Randy's arrest, investigators and prosecutors spent months trying to decipher the coded entries on Randy's scorecard. This process would prove crucial to understanding the full extent of Randy's crimes and linking him to specific murders. The scorecard contained 61 entries, each apparently referring to a different victim or crime. Some entries were relatively easy to decode, while others remained mysterious even after extensive investigation. The process of deciphering the scorecard would reveal the methodical, organized nature of Randy's crimes and his need to keep track of his kills. The first entry on the scorecard was stable, which prosecutors linked to Wayne Joseph Duquette, Randy's first suspected victim. Duquette had worked as a bartender at a gay bar called The Stables, making the connection clear. Although Duquette's death had initially been ruled as accidental alcohol poisoning, investigators now suspected that Randy had murdered him in 1971. EDM was decoded as referring to Edward Daniel Moore, the Marine whose murder in 1972 was Randy's first confirmed kill. Moore had been found with a sock inserted in his rectum, establishing one of Randy's signature methods. Jail Out referred to Roland Young, who was killed shortly after being released from the Orange County Jail. Young's murder showed Randy's ability to identify vulnerable victims and strike quickly. New Year's Eve was linked to a victim who had last been seen at a New Year's Eve party in San Juan Capistrano. This entry showed that Randy was paying attention to when and where he encountered his victims. Maureen Carson referred to Richard Allen Keith, a 20-year-old Marine who was killed in Carson, California, in 1978. Keith's body had been found with foreign objects inserted into it, following Randy's established pattern. MCHB tattoo was decoded as referring to a Marine Corps private with heavily tattooed arms who was last seen in Huntington Beach. Photographs of this victim were found in Randy's car, providing additional evidence of the connection. GR2 was believed to refer to 2 victims killed in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Randy had been in Grand Rapids on a business trip when these murders occurred, and witnesses had seen him talking to the victims before they disappeared. 2 in One Hitch appeared to refer to a double murder involving 2 hitchhikers who were killed together. This entry suggested that Randy had sometimes killed multiple victims during a single incident. Some entries on the scorecard remained unsolved even after extensive investigation. Entries like Angel, Hari Carey, Marine Down, and Van Driveway could not be definitively linked to specific crimes, though investigators suspected they represented additional murders that Randy had committed. The scorecard also revealed the geographic scope of Randy's crimes. Entries could be linked to murders in California, Oregon, and Michigan, showing that Randy had been killing across multiple states during his business travels. Prosecutors ultimately believed that they could connect 43 of the 45 murders they suspected Randy of committing to entries on the scorecard. The only murders not represented on the list were Randy's final 2 victims, Eric Herbert Church and Terry Lee Gambrell. This suggested that Randy had not had time to add these victims to his scorecard before his arrest. The scorecard served multiple purposes for Randy. It allowed him to keep an accurate count of his victims, which fed his ego and sense of accomplishment. It also served as a way for him to relive his crimes by reviewing the coded entries. Finally, it may have helped him avoid accidentally returning to dump sites or repeating certain methods that might establish patterns for investigators. The systematic nature of the scorecard demonstrated Randy's intelligence and organization. Unlike many serial killers who act impulsively, Randy was methodical and careful in documenting his crimes. This attention to detail would ultimately contribute to his conviction, as the scorecard provided a roadmap for investigators to understand the full scope of his criminal activity. Following Randy's arrest and the discovery of the scorecard and photographs, the investigation into his crimes expanded rapidly. Law enforcement agencies from across California, Oregon, and Michigan began reviewing their unsolved murder cases to see if they might be connected to Randy Kraft. The Orange County Sheriff's Department took the lead in coordinating the investigation, but they worked closely with dozens of other agencies. Detective Ray Sidebotham, who had initially questioned Randy after his arrest, became one of the primary investigators on the case. Within hours of the photographs being found in Randy's car, investigators were able to identify several of the victims pictured. In addition to Eric Church and Roger DeVole, other victims were recognized by investigators who had been working on their cases for months or years. The investigation revealed that Randy had been questioned by police on several previous occasions, but had always been able to avoid suspicion. His clean appearance, articulate manner, and seemingly legitimate lifestyle had helped him convince investigators that he was not involved in the crimes they were investigating. One particularly frustrating near-miss had occurred in 1975 when Randy was questioned about the disappearance of Keith Davin-Crotwell and the assault on Mark Hall. Randy had provided an alibi supported by Jeffrey Graves, and investigators had accepted their story. If they had been more suspicious at that time, Randy's killing spree might have been stopped 8 years earlier. The investigation also revealed the challenges that law enforcement had faced in connecting Randy's crimes. Because Randy killed across multiple jurisdictions and states, different agencies were investigating murders that were actually connected without realizing it. The scorecard helped investigators finally see the connections between cases that had previously seemed unrelated. As the investigation expanded, the number of murders potentially linked to Randy continued to grow. Initially, investigators believed Randy might be responsible for 16 murders. As they deciphered more of the scorecard and reviewed more cold cases, that number grew to 45, then to 67, and some investigators believed Randy might have been responsible for as many as 100 murders. The investigation was complicated by the fact that Randy refused to cooperate or confess to any of the crimes. Unlike many serial killers who eventually admit to their crimes or even boast about them, Randy maintained his innocence and never provided investigators with any information about his activities. This lack of cooperation from Randy meant that investigators had to build their case entirely on physical evidence, witness testimony, and circumstantial evidence. Fortunately, Randy had left behind a substantial amount of evidence, including the photographs, the scorecard, and physical evidence found in his car and home. The investigation also focused on trying to identify Randy's potential accomplices. Evidence from several crime scenes suggested that Randy had not acted alone in all of his murders. Some victims had been found in locations that would have been difficult for one person to access, and some crime scenes showed evidence of multiple perpetrators. Jeffrey Graves, Randy's former boyfriend, became a prime suspect as a potential accomplice. Graves had provided Randy with an alibi in 1975, and their relationship had lasted during some of Randy's most active killing years. However, Graves died of AIDS in 1987, before investigators could fully question him about his potential involvement. Jeff Seelig, Randy's roommate at the time of his arrest, was also investigated as a potential accomplice. However, investigators found no evidence that Seelig had knowledge of Randy's crimes, and he was never charged with any offenses. Seelig appeared to have been completely unaware of Randy's criminal activities despite living with him for 7 years. The investigation into Randy's crimes took more than 5 years to complete. During this time, Randy remained in custody, held without bail due to the severity of the charges against him and the risk that he posed to public safety. Prosecutors faced the challenge of deciding which murders to charge Randy with at trial. Although they suspected him of as many as 67 murders, they had the strongest evidence for 16 specific cases. These 16 murders would become the focus of Randy's trial, though prosecutors planned to introduce evidence of additional murders during the penalty phase if Randy was convicted. The 16 murders that Randy was charged with had all occurred in Orange County between 1972 and 1983. They included Edward Daniel Moore, the Marine who was Randy's first confirmed victim, as well as Terry Lee Gambrell, who was found dead in Randy's car. The other 14 victims represented a cross-section of Randy's crimes, showing his methods and patterns over more than a decade. Randy's defense team was led by attorney C. Thomas MacDonald. The defense faced an enormous challenge given the overwhelming amount of evidence against their client. They decided to pursue a strategy of challenging the evidence and suggesting alternative suspects, rather than trying to prove Randy's innocence outright. The defense argued that much of the evidence against Randy was circumstantial and that the prosecution had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Randy was the killer. They pointed out that investigators had initially believed some of the 16 victims had been killed by other serial killers, Patrick Kearney and William Bonin, and argued that there was no concrete evidence linking Randy to the murders. The defense also challenged the significance of the scorecard, arguing that it was meaningless and would only serve to inflame the jury against their client. Randy himself had claimed in a 1983 interview that the list was nothing more than references to friends of his and his roommate, not a record of murders. Prosecutors, led by Deputy District Attorney Brian F. Brown, prepared to present what they called the most comprehensive serial killer case in American history up to that time. They planned to call nearly 160 witnesses and introduce over 1,000 pieces of evidence. The evidence that prosecutors planned to present included the photographs found in Randy's car, the scorecard, physical evidence like bloodstains and fibers found in Randy's home and car, fingerprints found at crime scenes, the belt used to strangle Terry Gambrell, prescription drugs found in Randy's possession, and personal belongings of victims found in Randy's possession. Prosecutors also planned to present travel records and receipts that placed Randy in locations where victims had been abducted or found, witness testimony from people who had seen Randy with victims before they disappeared, and expert testimony about the patterns and methods used in the murders. The case was assigned to Superior Court Judge Donald A. McCartan, who would preside over what was expected to be a lengthy and complex trial. Judge McCartan was experienced in handling serious criminal cases, but even he acknowledged that the Randy Kraft case was unlike anything he had seen before. Jury selection was expected to take weeks, given the high-profile nature of the case and the graphic evidence that jurors would be required to view. The trial itself was expected to last at least a year, and experts predicted that the appeals process could take a decade or more. The case attracted significant media attention, both locally and nationally. Randy's crimes were among the most extensive and brutal in American history, and the discovery of his scorecard had captured public imagination. The trial would be closely watched by law enforcement, legal experts, and the general public. Randy Kraft's trial began on September 26, 1988, more than 5 years after his arrest. The delay had been caused by the complexity of the case, numerous defense motions, and the extensive investigation required to prepare for trial. Jury selection took 6 weeks, as attorneys questioned hundreds of potential jurors about their ability to fairly consider the evidence in such a gruesome case. The final jury consisted of 10 women and 2 men, all of whom had been sequestered to prevent them from being influenced by media coverage of the trial. In his opening statement, prosecutor Brian Brown painted a picture of Randy as a methodical killer who had used his car as a rolling platform for death as he roamed the freeways of Southern California looking for victims. Brown told the jury that Randy would pick up young male hitchhikers, drug them with alcohol and tranquilizers, torture and sexually abuse them, and then strangle them before dumping their bodies along freeways. Brown described Randy as a scorecard killer who kept meticulous records of his crimes and took photographs of his victims as trophies. He promised to show the jury overwhelming evidence that would prove Randy's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Defense attorney C. Thomas MacDonald argued that the prosecution's case was based largely on circumstantial evidence and that there was reasonable doubt about Randy's guilt. He pointed out that investigators had initially believed some of the victims had been killed by other serial killers and argued that the real killer or killers had never been caught. MacDonald dismissed the scorecard as meaningless scribblings that could mean anything, and he argued that the photographs and other evidence could have innocent explanations. He told the jury that Randy was an innocent man who had been wrongly accused of these terrible crimes. The prosecution's case was presented in reverse chronological order, beginning with Terry Lee Gambrell, who had been found dead in Randy's car, and ending with Edward Daniel Moore, who had been killed in 1972. This approach allowed prosecutors to start with their strongest evidence and work backward through Randy's criminal career. The testimony regarding Terry Gambrell was particularly compelling. The California Highway Patrol officers who had arrested Randy testified about finding Gambrell's body in the passenger seat of Randy's car. They described how Randy had acted as if Gambrell was simply sleeping, even asking if his friend was okay when confronted with the dead body. The medical examiner testified that Gambrell had been strangled with his own belt and that his hands had been bound with his own shoelaces. Toxicology results showed that Gambrell had high levels of alcohol and tranquilizers in his system at the time of his death. Prosecutors introduced the belt that had been used to strangle Gambrell, which had been found in Randy's car. They also showed the jury photographs of Gambrell's body and crime scene evidence that demonstrated the brutal nature of his murder. The testimony regarding the other 15 victims followed similar patterns. Prosecutors showed that Randy had been linked to each murder through physical evidence, witness testimony, or entries on a scorecard. They demonstrated that all of the murders followed similar patterns and methods, suggesting they had been committed by the same person. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence was the collection of photographs found in Randy's car. Prosecutors showed the jury photos that depicted several of the victims, either dead or unconscious. The background imagery in some photos showed that they had been taken at Randy's home, directly linking him to the victims. The scorecard was another crucial piece of evidence. Prosecutors went through each entry that they had been able to decode, showing how the cryptic references corresponded to specific victims and crimes. They argued that the scorecard was Randy's way of keeping track of his kills and reliving his crimes. The defense phase of Randy's trial focused primarily on challenging the prosecution's evidence and suggesting alternative explanations for the physical evidence that linked Randy to the murders. Defense attorney C. Thomas McDonald argued that many of the murders had initially been attributed to other killers, particularly Patrick Kearney and William Bonin, who were also operating in Southern California during the same time period. McDonald suggested that the Real killers were still at large and that Randy had been wrongly accused. The defense challenged the significance of the scorecard, arguing that it was simply a list of friends and acquaintances rather than a record of murders. They pointed out that Randy himself had explained the list as references to people he and his roommate Jeff Seelig knew, and they argued that the prosecution was reading meanings into the entries that were not there. McDonald also challenged some of the physical evidence, arguing that it was circumstantial and could have innocent explanations. He pointed out that some of the fiber and hair evidence could have been transferred through innocent contact, and he suggested that some of the other evidence might have been planted or contaminated. The defense called several character witnesses who testified about Randy's good reputation in the community. These witnesses included friends, co-workers, and family members who described Randy as intelligent, hardworking, and nonviolent. They expressed shock and disbelief that Randy could be capable of the crimes he was accused of. Randy's sister Kay Plunkett testified as a character witness for her brother. She described Randy as a loving family member who had always been kind and gentle. She said that the Randy she knew could never have committed these terrible crimes. The defense also presented expert testimony challenging some of the prosecution's forensic evidence. They questioned the reliability of some of the fingerprint and fiber evidence, and they argued that the prosecution had not proven that Randy was the source of all the physical evidence found at the crime scenes. One of the defense's arguments focused on the time of death for Terry Gambrell, the victim found in Randy's car. Defense attorney McDonald argued that Gambrell was not actually dead when the police found him, but was still alive, though barely. McDonald pointed to testimony from paramedics and hospital personnel that he claimed showed viable signs of life in Gambrell. This argument was significant because if Gambrell was still alive when found, it might suggest that Randy was not trying to kill him, but was perhaps trying to get him medical help. However, this argument was not very convincing given the evidence that Gambrell had been bound and strangled. The defense also suggested that Randy might have had accomplices who were the actual killers, while Randy was merely present at some of the crimes. They pointed to evidence from some crime scenes that suggested multiple perpetrators might have been involved. However, the defense faced an uphill battle given the overwhelming amount of evidence against Randy. The photographs, the scorecard, the physical evidence, and the body found in Randy's car created a very compelling case for the prosecution. Randy himself never testified during the trial. The defense made the strategic decision not to put him on the witness stand, likely because they felt his testimony would do more harm than good. Randy had refused to cooperate with investigators after his arrest, and his attorneys probably felt that his testimony would not be believable or helpful to his case. After hearing testimony for 13 months, the case went to the jury for deliberation in May 1989. The jury deliberated for 11 days before reaching their verdict, reflecting the complexity of the case and the enormous amount of evidence they had to consider. On May 12, 1989, the jury found Randy Kraft guilty on all counts. He was convicted of 16 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of sodomy, and 1 count of emasculation. Randy showed little emotion as the verdicts were read, though he appeared stunned when the first guilty verdict was announced. The families of Randy's victims were overcome with emotion as they heard the verdicts. Judy Nelson, whose 18-year-old son Jeffrey had been murdered by Randy in 1983, hugged her daughter and sister and broke into tears when her son's name was read. She later said that Randy should pay for destroying so many lives. Randy's family members, including 2 of his sisters and a niece, sat in the back of the courtroom in disbelief. His sister Kay Plunkett said she was shocked by the verdicts and that the case was a long way from being resolved. Following the guilty verdicts, the trial moved into the penalty phase, where the same jury would decide whether Randy should receive the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole. During this phase, prosecutors were allowed to present evidence of additional murders that Randy had committed but had not been charged with. Prosecutors introduced evidence of several additional homicides in Oregon and Michigan that they believed Randy had committed. They argued that Randy was one of the most prolific serial killers in American history and that his crimes warranted the ultimate punishment. The prosecution described Randy as a sadistic killer who had tortured his victims and taken pleasure in their suffering. They argued that his crimes were so heinous and extensive that death was the only appropriate sentence. The defense tried to present mitigating evidence that might convince the jury to spare Randy's life. They introduced testimony about a PET scan that had been conducted on Randy's brain, which they claimed showed abnormalities in his frontal lobes. The defense argued that these abnormalities might have reduced Randy's ability to control his emotions and impulses. However, prosecutors dismissed this testimony, arguing that there is nothing wrong with Randy's mind except that he enjoyed killing for sexual satisfaction. They pointed out that Randy had been able to hold down jobs, maintain relationships, and live a seemingly normal life while committing his crimes, which showed that he was in control of his actions. On August 11, 1989, after deliberating during the penalty phase, the jury returned a verdict of death. They found that the aggravating circumstances of Randy's crimes outweighed any mitigating factors and that he deserved to be executed for his crimes. Judge Donald A. McCartan formally sentenced Randy to death on November 29, 1989. In pronouncing the sentence, Judge McCartan said that Randy's crimes were hard for me to comprehend and that he could not imagine anyone committing such terrible acts. Judge McCartan noted that he had sentenced 8 or 9 other defendants to death during his career, but that all of the aggravating circumstances in those other cases combined did not match Randy's record. He said, "If anyone ever deserved the death penalty, he's got it coming." The sentence brought mixed reactions from the families of Randy's victims. Some expressed satisfaction that Randy would pay the ultimate price for his crimes, while others said that no punishment could bring back their loved ones or undo the suffering that Randy had caused. Darwin Hall, the father of one of Randy's victims, shouted out as Randy was led from the courtroom, "Burn in hell, Kraft." This outburst reflected the intense emotions and anger that Randy's crimes had generated among the families of his victims. On November 30, 1989, the day after his sentencing, Randy Kraft was flown from Orange County to San Quentin State Prison to begin serving his death sentence. He was transported in a private aircraft owned by a reserve Orange County Sheriff's Department member. During the flight to San Quentin, Randy was described as quiet and subdued by the deputies who accompanied him. He did not speak to the deputies during the flight and was formally turned over to state authorities when he arrived at the prison. San Quentin State Prison houses California's death row, where Randy joined hundreds of other condemned inmates awaiting execution. Randy was assigned to a small cell where he would spend most of his time alone, allowed out only for limited exercise periods and visits. Randy's trial had lasted more than 13 months and was the most expensive trial in Orange County history at that time. Legal experts predicted that the appeals process could take 10 years or more, and they were right. Randy's case would wind through the appeals courts for decades. Randy has maintained his innocence throughout his time on death row. Unlike many serial killers who eventually confess to their crimes or provide details about their methods, Randy has never admitted to killing anyone. He has consistently denied any involvement in the murders he was convicted of. Randy's refusal to confess or cooperate has frustrated investigators who believe he could help solve additional cold cases. There are still approximately 15 entries on Randy's scorecard that have never been definitively linked to specific victims, and investigators believe Randy could provide information about these and other unsolved murders. Despite being on death row for more than 3 decades, Randy has never been executed. California has had very few executions since the death penalty was reinstated, and Randy's case has been tied up in appeals for years. He has filed numerous appeals challenging his conviction and sentence, though none have been successful. Randy's case has continued to generate interest among true crime researchers, journalists, and law enforcement officials. Several books have been written about his crimes, including Angel of Darkness by Dennis McDougal, which is considered the definitive account of Randy's life and crimes. As recently as 2023 and 2025, investigators have continued to identify additional victims of Randy's crimes using modern DNA technology and investigative genetic genealogy. In 2023, Michael Ray Schlicht was identified as a likely early victim of Randy from 1974. In 2025, Larry Eugene Parks was identified as another victim from 1980. These recent identifications show that Randy's crimes are still having an impact more than 40 years after they were committed. Families who had wondered for decades about the fate of their missing loved ones are finally getting answers, though those answers bring both closure and renewed grief. Randy is now 80 years old and has spent more than half his life on death row. He remains at San Quentin State Prison, though the prison has been renamed the San Quentin Rehabilitation Center as part of recent reforms to the California prison system. Randy Kraft's case has had a lasting impact on law enforcement, criminal investigation techniques, and our understanding of serial killers. His crimes represent one of the most extensive and well-documented serial killing sprees in American history. The discovery of Randy's scorecard was particularly significant because it provided investigators with a unique window into the mind of a serial killer. Most serial killers do not keep such detailed records of their crimes, and Randy's methodical approach to documenting his murders has been studied by criminal profilers and behavioral analysts. The scorecard showed that Randy was highly organized and methodical in his approach to murder. Unlike disorganized killers who act impulsively, Randy planned his crimes carefully and kept detailed records. This organization helped him avoid detection for more than a decade and made him one of the most successful serial killers in terms of the number of victims he was able to kill before being caught. Randy's case also highlighted the challenges that law enforcement faces when dealing with serial killers who operate across multiple jurisdictions. Randy's crimes spanned several states and dozens of local law enforcement agencies, making it difficult to see the connections between related cases. The investigation into Randy's crimes helped establish better communication and cooperation between different law enforcement agencies. The success in connecting Randy to murders across multiple states showed the importance of sharing information and coordinating investigations when dealing with serial crimes. Randy's case has also been significant in the development of criminal profiling techniques. The FBI and other agencies have studied Randy's methods, victim selection, and behavior patterns to better understand how serial killers operate and how they can be caught more quickly. The physical evidence found in Randy's case, including the photographs and personal items belonging to victims, has been important in developing evidence collection and preservation techniques. The success of the prosecution in Randy's case showed the importance of thorough crime scene investigation and careful evidence handling. Randy's crimes have also had a lasting impact on the families of his victims and the communities where he operated. The trauma caused by his murders has affected hundreds of people, including family members, friends, and witnesses who were involved in the investigation and trial. Many of the families of Randy's victims have become advocates for victims' rights and have worked to ensure that other families receive the support and information they need when dealing with violent crimes. Their advocacy has helped improve victim services and support programs. Randy's case has also contributed to discussions about the death penalty and its application in cases involving multiple murders. Randy's case is often cited by both supporters and opponents of capital punishment as an example of why the death penalty is or is not appropriate. The fact that Randy has been on death row for more than 30 years without being executed has highlighted the lengthy appeals process in capital cases and the practical challenges of implementing the death penalty. His case has been part of broader discussions about the effectiveness and morality of capital punishment. Randy's crimes have also been studied by researchers interested in understanding the causes of serial killing. His case has been analyzed from psychological, sociological, and criminological perspectives in an effort to understand what factors might have contributed to his becoming a serial killer. Despite extensive study, Randy's case raises more questions than it answers about the nature of serial killing. His seemingly normal childhood and successful adult life make it difficult to identify clear warning signs or risk factors that might have predicted his criminal behavior. Despite Randy Kraft's conviction for 16 murders and his suspected involvement in dozens more, many aspects of his case remain unsolved mysteries that continue to intrigue investigators and researchers. One of the biggest unsolved mysteries is the question of Randy's accomplices. Evidence from several crime scenes strongly suggests that Randy did not act alone in all of his murders. Some victims were found in locations that would have been difficult for one person to access alone, and some crime scenes showed evidence of multiple perpetrators. The most likely suspect for being Randy's primary accomplice was Jeffrey Allen Graves, Randy's boyfriend from 1971 to 1976. Graves had provided Randy with a false alibi for at least one crime, and their relationship lasted during some of Randy's most active killing years. However, Graves died of AIDS in 1987 before investigators could fully question him about his potential involvement. Before his death, Graves took a polygraph test and made the mysterious comment, "I'm really not going to pay for it, you know." This statement suggested that he might have had knowledge of Randy's crimes, but he passed the polygraph test and died before investigators could explore this further. Another potential accomplice was Bob Jackson, a small-time criminal who reportedly confessed to murdering 2 hitchhikers with Randy in Wyoming and Colorado in the mid-1970s. However, authorities in those states were unable to corroborate Jackson's claims, and his involvement remains unproven. Jeff Seelig, Randy's roommate at the time of his arrest, was also investigated as a potential accomplice, but investigators found no evidence of his involvement. Seelig appeared to have been genuinely unaware of Randy's criminal activities despite living with him for 7 years. Another major unsolved mystery is the meaning of the remaining entries on Randy's scorecard. Of the 61 entries on the list, investigators were able to definitively connect about 43 to specific victims or crimes. The remaining entries, including Angel, Hari Carey, Marine Down, and Van Driveway, have never been solved. These unsolved entries likely represent additional murders that Randy committed, but without more information from Randy himself, investigators may never be able to connect them to specific crimes. Randy's continued refusal to cooperate means that these cases will likely remain unsolved unless new evidence emerges. The total number of Randy's victims also remains a mystery. He was convicted of 16 murders, but investigators believe he may have killed as many as 67 people based on his scorecard. Some investigators think the actual number could be even higher, possibly reaching 100 or more victims. Randy's killing career may have started earlier than 1971, and he may have committed murders in additional states beyond California, Oregon, and Michigan. His work as a computer consultant required him to travel frequently, and he may have used these business trips to commit crimes in other locations. The methods Randy used to select and approach his victims also remain partially mysterious. While investigators understand his general patterns, they do not fully understand how he was able to consistently lure victims into his vehicle without arousing suspicion. His success rate in finding and killing victims suggests that he had developed very effective techniques for gaining victims' trust. Randy's psychological motivation for killing also remains largely unknown. Unlike some serial killers who have provided extensive information about their thoughts and feelings, Randy has never explained why he killed or what he got out of it. His refusal to undergo psychological evaluation or cooperate with researchers means that his motivations remain largely speculative. The question of when Randy first started killing is also unresolved. His first suspected victim, Wayne Duquette, was killed in 1971, but Randy may have committed earlier murders that have never been connected to him. His scorecard suggests that he had been killing for some time before investigators became aware of his crimes. Randy's case also raises questions about how many other serial killers might be operating undetected. The fact that Randy was able to kill for more than a decade without being caught suggests that other killers might be able to do the same. His case has made law enforcement more aware of the need to look for patterns across jurisdictions and time periods. In recent years, advances in DNA technology and investigative genetic genealogy have brought new developments to Randy Kraft's case, leading to the identification of additional victims and potentially solving cold cases that have remained unsolved for decades. In November 2023, the Orange County Sheriff's Department announced that they had identified Michael Ray Schlicht as a victim of Randy Kraft nearly 50 years after his murder. Schlicht, a teenager from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, had been found dead in Orange County in 1974, but his identity had remained unknown until investigators used investigative genetic genealogy to connect him to his family. Schlicht was believed to be one of Randy's earliest victims, killed in 1974 when Randy's murder spree was just beginning to escalate. The identification of Schlicht provided new insights into Randy's early crimes and confirmed that he had been killing even more people than investigators had previously known. In May 2025, Oregon State Police announced that they had identified Larry Eugene Parks as another victim of Randy Kraft. Parks, a 30-year-old Vietnam veteran, had been found dead along Interstate 5 in Oregon in July 1980, but had remained unidentified for nearly 45 years. The identification of Parks was made possible through a collaboration between the Oregon State Police Cold Case Unit and the Orange County Sheriff's Department. Investigators used forensic genetic genealogy to develop a genetic profile from a blood sample and then worked with potential relatives to confirm Parks' identity. Parks' case was particularly significant because it confirmed Randy's involvement in the Oregon murders that investigators had long suspected him of committing. The discovery of Parks' identity also helped investigators better understand Randy's travel patterns and his method of selecting victims in different states. These recent identifications have been made possible by advances in DNA technology that were not available during Randy's original investigation and trial in the 1980s. Investigative genetic genealogy allows investigators to use DNA samples to build family trees and identify victims or suspects even when they are not in criminal databases. The use of these new technologies has also raised hopes that additional victims of Randy's crimes might be identified in the future. There are still several unidentified victims from the 1970s and 1980s in California and other states who might be connected to Randy through DNA evidence. Beyond victim identification, DNA technology has also been used to look for additional evidence in Randy's case. Investigators have re-examined evidence from crime scenes using modern DNA analysis techniques that can detect much smaller samples and provide more detailed information than was possible in the 1980s. Some of this reanalysis has confirmed Randy's involvement in crimes where the original evidence was less conclusive. In other cases, DNA evidence has revealed the presence of additional perpetrators, supporting the theory that Randy sometimes worked with accomplices. The continued investigation of Randy's crimes using modern technology has also helped law enforcement agencies improve their techniques for investigating serial crimes. The success in connecting Randy to additional victims decades after his original conviction has shown the value of maintaining cold case files and continuing to investigate unsolved murders even when they are very old. These developments have also brought renewed attention to Randy's case from researchers, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts. New books, documentaries, and podcasts have examined Randy's crimes in light of the new evidence and identifications. The ongoing investigation has also provided some measure of closure to families who had wondered for decades about the fate of their missing loved ones. While learning that a family member was murdered is traumatic, many families have expressed gratitude for finally knowing what happened and being able to properly memorialize their loved ones. Even though Randy Kraft has been in prison for more than 40 years and on death row for more than 30 years, the investigation into his crimes continues. Law enforcement agencies in California, Oregon, Michigan, and other states continue to review cold cases that might be connected to Randy's killing spree. The Orange County Sheriff's Department maintains an active investigation into Randy's crimes and regularly reviews new evidence and potential connections to unsolved cases. Investigators continue to work with other agencies to identify patterns that might link Randy to additional murders. One focus of the ongoing investigation is trying to identify the remaining victims represented by unsolved entries on Randy's scorecard. Investigators continue to analyze the cryptic references on the list, looking for clues that might help them connect these entries to specific crimes or victims. Investigators have also continued to look for Randy's potential accomplices, even though many years have passed since his arrest. While Jeffrey Graves died in 1987 and other potential accomplices may also have died, investigators continue to follow leads and examine evidence that might reveal who helped Randy commit his crimes. The investigation has also expanded to look for crimes that Randy might have committed, but that do not appear on his scorecard. Investigators believe that Randy may have committed murders before he started keeping his scorecard, or that he may have failed to record some of his crimes on the list. Law enforcement agencies have also used Randy's case to help train investigators in recognizing the signs of serial crime activity. Randy's methods and patterns have been studied and used to develop profiles of similar killers who might be operating today. The continued investigation has also benefited from advances in criminal investigation techniques beyond DNA analysis. Improvements in fingerprint analysis, fiber evidence, and other forensic techniques have allowed investigators to re-examine evidence from Randy's crimes with greater precision. Digital technology has also played a role in the ongoing investigation. Investigators have been able to digitize and enhance photographs and other evidence from Randy's case, sometimes revealing details that were not visible with older technology. The investigation has also been aided by the development of better databases and information sharing systems among law enforcement agencies. These systems make it easier for investigators to identify connections between crimes that occur in different jurisdictions or time periods. Public interest in Randy's case has also contributed to the ongoing investigation. Tips from the public, including people who may have encountered Randy or witnessed suspicious activity, continue to provide leads for investigators to follow. The families of Randy's victims have also remained active in pushing for continued investigation of his crimes. Many families have formed support groups and advocacy organizations that work to keep pressure on law enforcement to continue investigating cold cases. Some families have also worked to ensure that Randy's case is not forgotten by the public. They have participated in documentaries, interviews, and other media projects that keep attention focused on Randy's crimes and need to identify his remaining victims. The ongoing investigation has also raised questions about Randy's current mental state and whether he might be willing to cooperate with investigators after all these years. Some investigators believe that Randy, now in his 80s and having spent most of his adult life in prison, might be more willing to provide information about his crimes. However, Randy has shown no signs of changing his position on cooperating with investigators. He continues to maintain his innocence and has not provided any information that would help solve additional cases or answer the many questions that remain about his crimes. Randy Kraft's case has been extensively studied by criminal psychologists, behavioral analysts, and law enforcement profilers who have tried to understand what made him such a prolific and successful serial killer. His case has contributed significantly to our understanding of how serial killers operate and what factors might contribute to their development. One of the most striking aspects of Randy's case is how he was able to maintain the appearance of a normal, successful life while committing dozens of murders over more than a decade. Unlike many serial killers who have obvious psychological problems or troubled backgrounds, Randy appeared to be a well-adjusted, intelligent, and productive member of society. Randy held steady employment as a computer programmer and consultant, a field that required intelligence, attention to detail, and the ability to work with others. His co-workers and supervisors described him as competent, reliable, and pleasant to work with. This legitimate career also provided Randy with cover for his crimes and access to travel that allowed him to kill in multiple states. Randy was able to maintain long-term relationships, living with Jeffrey Graves for several years and then with Jeff Seelig for 7 years. His partners described him as caring, committed, and loving, though they also noted that he could be moody and would sometimes disappear for days at a time. Randy was politically active and had a circle of friends who saw him as intelligent and engaged with current events. He had successfully transitioned from being very conservative in college to becoming liberal and supporting democratic causes. This political engagement showed his ability to adapt and change his persona as needed. Randy's family relationships also appeared to be normal. His sisters and other family members expressed shock and disbelief when he was arrested, saying that the Randy they knew could never have committed such crimes. Even after his conviction, some family members continued to believe in his innocence. This ability to compartmentalize his life and maintain different personas for different audiences was one of Randy's most remarkable characteristics. Criminal profilers have noted that Randy was essentially living multiple lives simultaneously: his public life as a successful professional, his private life as a gay man in a committed relationship, and his secret life as a serial killer. Randy's intelligence was also a crucial factor in his success as a killer. His IQ of 129 put him in the top few percent of the population, and this intelligence helped him plan his crimes carefully, avoid detection, and manipulate the people around him. Randy's organizational skills were evident in his scorecard, which showed a methodical approach to documenting his crimes. Unlike disorganized killers who act impulsively, Randy was able to plan his murders, execute them carefully, and avoid leaving evidence that would lead back to him. Randy's victim selection also showed careful planning and intelligence. He typically targeted vulnerable individuals who were less likely to be immediately missed if they disappeared. His focus on Marines, hitchhikers, and gay men meant that he was preying on people who might be away from their families or living secretive lives. Randy's geographic mobility also contributed to his success. His work-related travel allowed him to commit crimes in different states, making it harder for law enforcement to connect the murders and identify patterns. This mobility also gave Randy access to fresh hunting grounds where he was not known to local authorities. Psychologists have struggled to identify clear developmental factors that might explain Randy's criminal behavior. His childhood appeared to be relatively normal, though he did experience some early accidents and may have felt neglected by his father. However, many people experience similar circumstances without becoming serial killers. Randy's homosexuality has been cited by some analysts as a potential factor in his crimes, particularly given that many of his victims were also gay or bisexual men. Some theories suggest that Randy may have been acting out internalized homophobia or anger about his own sexuality. However, this theory is not strongly supported, as Randy appeared to be relatively comfortable with his sexual orientation and was able to maintain relationships with other men. The fact that Randy has never cooperated with psychological evaluation or provided insight into his motivations has made it difficult for researchers to understand his psychological profile. His continued denial of his crimes means that analysts can only speculate about his thought processes and emotional state. Randy Kraft's case had a significant impact on law enforcement practices, particularly in the areas of interagency cooperation, serial crime investigation, and evidence handling. The challenges that investigators faced in connecting Randy's crimes across multiple jurisdictions led to important changes in how law enforcement agencies work together on complex cases. One of the major lessons from Randy's case was the importance of sharing information between different law enforcement agencies. Randy's crimes spanned multiple cities, counties, and states, but investigators in different jurisdictions were not initially aware that they were looking for the same killer. The success in eventually connecting Randy to murders across different states showed the value of creating better communication systems between agencies. This led to the development of improved databases and information sharing protocols that allow investigators to more easily identify patterns in crimes that occur across jurisdictional boundaries. Randy's case also highlighted the importance of looking for patterns in seemingly unrelated crimes. The discovery of Randy's scorecard helped investigators realize that murders they had thought were committed by different killers were actually the work of the same person. This led to changes in how investigators analyze crime patterns and look for connections between cases. Law enforcement agencies now routinely compare methods, victim characteristics, and other factors across different cases to identify potential serial offenders. The physical evidence in Randy's case, particularly the photographs and personal items belonging to victims, also had an impact on evidence collection and preservation practices. The success of the prosecution showed the importance of thorough crime scene investigation and careful evidence handling. Randy's case contributed to the development of better protocols for collecting, storing, and analyzing physical evidence. The techniques developed for analyzing Randy's evidence have been used in subsequent serial killer investigations and have helped solve many other cases. The case also showed the importance of keeping detailed records and maintaining cold case files. Many of the connections made in Randy's case were possible only because investigators had preserved evidence and documentation from older cases that might otherwise have been discarded. Randy's case was also important in the development of criminal profiling techniques. The FBI and other agencies studied Randy's methods, victim selection, and behavioral patterns to better understand how serial killers operate and how they can be identified more quickly. The profiles developed from Randy's case have been used to help identify other serial killers and to focus investigations on the most likely suspects. The techniques developed for analyzing Randy's crimes have become standard tools in serial crime investigation. Randy's case also had an impact on victim services and support for families of crime victims. The large number of victims and families involved in Randy's case highlighted the need for better support systems and communication with victims' families during long and complex investigations. Many of the families of Randy's victims became advocates for victims' rights and helped develop better protocols for keeping families informed about the progress of investigations and legal proceedings. The lengthy trial and appeals process in Randy's case also contributed to discussions about how to handle complex serial killer cases more efficiently while still ensuring fair legal proceedings. The 13-month trial was extremely expensive and emotionally draining for all involved, leading to efforts to streamline similar cases in the future. Randy's case has also been used in training programs for law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and other criminal justice professionals. The case provides a comprehensive example of how serial killer investigations should be conducted and what challenges investigators are likely to face. The ongoing investigation of Randy's crimes using modern DNA technology has also shown the value of maintaining active cold case programs. The recent identifications of additional victims have demonstrated that even very old cases can be solved with new technology and persistent investigation. Randy Kraft's case received extensive media coverage both during his active killing years and after his arrest and trial. The case captured public attention due to the large number of victims, the brutal nature of the crimes, and the discovery of Randy's scorecard, which provided a unique window into the mind of a serial killer. During Randy's active killing years from 1971 to 1983, media coverage focused on the series of unsolved murders that were terrorizing Southern California. The discovery of bodies along freeways led to extensive coverage of what were initially called the Freeway Killings. The media coverage during this period was complicated by the fact that there were actually 3 different serial killers operating in Southern California at the same time. Patrick Kearney, William Bonin, and Randy Kraft were all killing young men and dumping their bodies near freeways, but investigators and the media did not initially realize that there were multiple killers. When Patrick Kearney was arrested in 1977, media coverage suggested that the Freeway Killings had been solved. However, the murders continued, leading to confusion and concern that the real killer was still at large. Similar confusion occurred when William Bonin was arrested in 1980. Randy's arrest in 1983 finally provided answers to many of the unsolved murders, but it also revealed the shocking scope of his crimes. The discovery of his scorecard and photographs of victims created a media sensation, with Randy being dubbed the Scorecard Killer by the press. Media coverage of Randy's case was extensive throughout his investigation and trial. The case was covered by local and national news outlets, magazines, and television programs. The graphic nature of the evidence and the large number of victims made it one of the most closely watched criminal cases of the 1980s. The lengthy trial process also provided ongoing material for media coverage. The 13-month trial was covered extensively by local media, and the testimony about Randy's crimes provided shocking details that kept public attention focused on the case. Randy's case has continued to generate media interest long after his conviction. Several books have been written about his crimes, with Dennis McDougal's Angel of Darkness being considered the definitive account of the case. The case has also been featured in numerous television documentaries, true crime programs, and podcasts. These productions have introduced Randy's case to new generations of viewers and have helped keep public attention focused on the unsolved aspects of his crimes. The media coverage of Randy's case has had both positive and negative effects. On the positive side, the coverage has helped keep public attention focused on the unsolved murders and has generated tips and information that have helped investigators. The coverage has also helped educate the public about the dangers of serial killers and the importance of being cautious around strangers. However, the media coverage has also sometimes sensationalized Randy's crimes in ways that may have been harmful to the families of his victims. Some coverage has focused more on the shocking details of the murders than on remembering the victims as human beings who had their lives cut short. The media coverage has also sometimes included inaccurate information or speculation that has confused the public understanding of Randy's case. The complexity of the case and the large amount of evidence have made it difficult for journalists to always report accurately on all aspects of the investigation. Randy's case has also been used by researchers and journalists as an example of how media coverage of serial killer cases can influence public perceptions of crime and criminals. The extensive coverage of Randy's case contributed to public fascination with serial killers that continues today. The case has also raised questions about how much detail should be included in media coverage of violent crimes. The graphic nature of Randy's crimes has led to debates about whether detailed coverage serves the public interest or simply exploits the suffering of victims and their families. While Randy Kraft's case is often discussed in terms of the shocking scope of his crimes and his methods of killing, it is important to remember that each of his victims was an individual human being with their own life, dreams, and people who loved them. Edward Daniel Moore, Randy's first confirmed victim, was a 20-year-old Marine from Camp Pendleton who was killed on December 26, 1972. Moore had joined the Marines to serve his country and had his whole life ahead of him when he encountered Randy. His family and fellow Marines mourned his loss and struggled to understand how such a young man with so much potential could have his life ended so brutally. Terry Lee Gambrell, Randy's final victim, was a 25-year-old Marine who was found dead in Randy's car on May 14, 1983. Gambrell's murder led to Randy's arrest and the end of his killing spree. Gambrell had been serving his country at Camp Pendleton and was looking forward to completing his military service when his life was cut short. Eric Herbert Church was a 21-year-old from Hartford, Connecticut, who was hitchhiking across the country when he encountered Randy in 1983. Church was adventurous and curious about the world, and his cross-country journey was meant to be an adventure that would help him figure out his future. Instead, he became one of Randy's final victims. Jeffrey Allen Nelson was an 18-year-old from Buena Park, California, who was murdered along with his friend Roger James DeVole Jr. in February 1983. Nelson's mother, Judy Nelson, became one of the most vocal advocates for victims' rights after her son's murder. She attended Randy's trial and spoke about the impact that his crimes had on families like hers. Vincent Cruz Mestas was a 23-year-old bisexual art student whose body was found in the San Bernardino Mountains in December 1973. Mestas was pursuing his education and developing his artistic talents when his life was ended by Randy's violence. His murder was particularly brutal, with his hands being severed and never found. Roland Young was a 23-year-old who was released from the Orange County Jail on June 10, 1978, and was murdered by Randy just one day later. Young had been dealing with some legal troubles, but he was trying to get his life back on track when Randy killed him. His murder appeared on Randy's scorecard as jail out. Michael Ray Schlicht was a teenager from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, who was identified in 2023 as one of Randy's earliest victims. Schlicht had been hitchhiking and was known to love warm weather, which may have brought him to California, where he encountered Randy in 1974. His family had wondered for nearly 50 years what had happened to him before his identity was finally confirmed. Larry Eugene Parks was a 30-year-old Vietnam veteran who was identified in 2025 as another of Randy's victims. Parks had served his country in Vietnam and was trying to build a life for himself himself when he was killed by Randy in Oregon in 1980. His family had lost contact with him in 1979 and had wondered about his fate for more than 40 years. Many of Randy's other victims remain unidentified or are known only by their names and basic details. Each of these individuals had families, friends, and communities who were affected by their deaths. Some were young men just starting their adult lives, while others were trying to overcome challenges and build better futures for themselves. The families of Randy's victims have shown remarkable strength and resilience in dealing with their losses. Many have become advocates for victims' rights and have worked to ensure that other families receive the support and information they need when dealing with violent crimes. Some families have established memorials or foundations in honor of their loved ones. Others have participated in the ongoing investigation by providing information to investigators or supporting efforts to identify additional victims. The impact of Randy's crimes extends far beyond his immediate victims to include the families, friends, and communities who were affected by the losses. Parents, siblings, partners, and children of Randy's victims have all had to deal with the trauma of losing someone they loved to such senseless violence. The fact that Randy has never admitted to his crimes or provided any explanation for them has made it even more difficult for families to find closure. Many family members have expressed frustration that Randy has never shown any remorse or provided information that might help them understand what happened to their loved ones. As Randy Kraft enters his 80th year and his 4th decade on death row, his case continues to evolve and generate new developments. The recent identification of additional victims using modern DNA technology shows that Randy's crimes are still having an impact more than 40 years after they were committed. Randy remains incarcerated at San Quentin State Prison, now renamed the San Quentin Rehabilitation Center, where he has spent most of his adult life. He has never been executed despite being sentenced to death in 1989, as California has had very few executions since the death penalty was reinstated. Randy's case has been through numerous appeals over the years, but none have been successful in overturning his conviction or death sentence. His attorneys have raised various arguments challenging the evidence against him and the fairness of his trial, but courts have consistently upheld his conviction. The lengthy appeals process in Randy's case reflects the complexity of death penalty cases and the extensive legal review that such cases receive. While some people believe that Randy should have been executed years ago, others argue that the lengthy appeals process is necessary to ensure that innocent people are not wrongly executed. Randy's case continues to be studied by researchers, law enforcement professionals, and students of criminal justice. His crimes represent one of the most extensive and well-documented serial killing sprees in American history, making his case valuable for understanding how serial killers operate and how they can be caught. The ongoing investigation of Randy's crimes using modern technology shows that law enforcement has not given up on solving the remaining mysteries in his case. The recent identification of additional victims demonstrates that new evidence can still emerge even decades after the original crimes were committed. However, many questions about Randy's crimes may never be answered unless Randy himself decides to cooperate with investigators. His continued refusal to admit to his crimes or provide information about them means that families of victims and law enforcement may never get complete answers about his activities. Randy's case has also contributed to ongoing discussions about the death penalty and its application in cases involving multiple murders. Some people point to Randy's case as an example of why the death penalty is necessary for the most heinous crimes, while others argue that his lengthy time on death row shows that the system is not working effectively. The impact of Randy's crimes continues to be felt by the families of his victims, many of whom are still alive and continue to advocate for victims' rights and support for other families dealing with violent crimes. Their strength and resilience in the face of such terrible losses is a testament to the human capacity to survive and find meaning even in the darkest circumstances. Randy's case has also had a lasting impact on the communities where he operated. The fear and terror that his crimes created in Southern California during the 1970s and early 1980s changed how people thought about personal safety and trusting strangers. The case has influenced law enforcement practices, victim services, and public awareness about serial crimes. The lessons learned from Randy's case have been applied to subsequent investigations and have helped catch other serial killers more quickly. As new technology continues to develop, it is possible that additional evidence related to Randy's crimes will emerge. DNA analysis, digital forensics, and other scientific techniques may reveal new information about his crimes or help identify additional victims. The story of Randy Kraft serves as a reminder of the capacity for evil that can exist in seemingly ordinary people and the importance of remaining vigilant about personal safety. It also demonstrates the dedication of law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and investigators who work tirelessly to bring criminals to justice and provide answers to victims' families. While Randy's killing spree ended with his arrest in 1983, the impact of his crimes continues to this day. The families of his victims, the investigators who worked on his case, and the communities affected by his crimes all carry the memory of what he did. Their efforts to ensure that Randy's victims are not forgotten and that justice is served provide hope that good can ultimately triumph over even the most terrible evil. Randy Kraft's story is ultimately one of the triumph of justice over evil, of the dedication of investigators who never gave up, and of families who found the strength to seek justice for their loved ones. While Randy succeeded in taking many lives and causing immeasurable pain, he was ultimately caught, convicted, and held accountable for his crimes. The story of the Scorecard Killer serves as both a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk behind ordinary appearances and an inspiring example of how persistence, dedication, and modern technology can help solve even the most complex criminal cases. Randy Kraft may have believed that he was smarter than law enforcement and that he would never be caught, but in the end, justice prevailed, and his reign of terror was brought to an end. Today, Randy Kraft remains